Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My guest in this episode is BRUCE KAUFFMAN, a local poet who has made significant contributions to our literary community. BRUCE has published several collections of his own work and is a tireless advocate for poetry and the arts. He has also organized numerous open mic sessions, providing a platform for other local poets to share their work and gain exposure. Moreover, BRUCE is the host of the weekly radio show Finding a Voice, which explores the rich world of poetry and prose, expanding the audience for these important art forms. So sit back, relax, and join us as we explore the world of poetry with BRUCE KAUFFMAN. BRUCE, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to come out. It really means a lot, so thanks a lot, Dave.
My pleasure. We'll remind our listeners that we are recording this particular podcast in mid-February 2023. And I'll start off by telling you that I'm one of those individuals who has never taken the time to appreciate poetry, but hopefully by the end of this conversation that will have changed. So I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you very much.
We're going to talk about a film that has made the rounds. It was produced back in 2019, and it's called Who is BRUCE KAUFFMAN? And we'll talk a bit more about the movie later, but I wanted to start with this. The very first words that come out of the movie, as I recall, and I think it's you talking at the beginning, and you say that the poet is the priest of the invisible. Is that you talking in this
That
book?
is me talking, and that's actually a quote. Wallace Stevens, I believe, was the person that coined that phrase in a short way of defining what a poet is. So, yeah.
What does it mean to you as a poet?
It means to me, I guess, a poet's always just sort of looking through things, looking at things, but almost, I think, or at least personally, I think it's looking past into, it's looking into that part of which that we either just see and don't realize that we see and take for granted just because it's so visible, or it's just that it also means that I think that we're looking for what's underneath things, what's behind things, what's happening that isn't really seen.
Where did the bug for writing begin for you?
To be honest with you, I've been searching for that, and I think I've narrowed it down to about when I think I have decided what it is. I realized, no, there was probably something before that. Just to make a long story short, there were some definitely huge events, at least for me, being a poet, at least 3 or 4 of those that either propelled me or reminded me or whatever. But I really think, and I've gone back as far as I can possibly go, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this for a while, but my mother, when my sister and I were very young, probably like maybe 3 or 4 or 5, something like that, she used to read to us at night, and I still remember her reading. I don't remember anything else that she read to us, but she read a poem called Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. And I loved it so much when I was that age. And I remember she didn't read to us every night, but she read to us often enough. I remember requesting that. And most of the time she would just kind of, no, I'm going to read this. But that's how much I loved it. And I think that was the main seed. There was also, I don't know how much in detail you want me to go into here, in high school, it was grade 12, was an English class, and we were given an assignment in that 45-minute or hour-long class, whatever it was, we're presented with several poems written by different famous people. And our assignment for that session was to write a poem, read through these and write a poem. And I mean, that was the last thing on my mind that I wanted to do that day. But I found it I enjoyed the process. Mm-hmm. And I read a poem by E.E. Cummings, and I'd never seen poetry like that. And it just and then also, actually before that, I was 14, I saw the movie Dr. Zhivago.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, okay, I'll let you bring that up.
Well, no. Go ahead and I was interested in how that plays into poetry.
Okay. I was blown away by that movie. Again, I was 14, 15 years old. The movie had just come out, as I recall. We lived out in the country, and we lived in away from a big city, really, far enough away that I'm sure the smaller city it finally came to had probably been out for a while. But we did get it fairly close, I think. And I fell in love with the movie. And I remember thinking then, and thinking more than anything else I ever wanted to be true, is that I would be a poet one day. And I believed that. And so that was definitely one of the key moments.
So we all have these various things that occur in our lives, and sometimes we don't realize that they are happening as they are happening.
Exactly.
But when you go back and look at them, they have had a major impact.
Yeah, exactly.
So you went to school. You were brought up in Colorado, right?
Yeah.
And you went to university in Colorado.
I did.
And from what I have read is that's where you wrote your first poem.
Yeah, after the one in high school in that class. And that became very much almost a daily activity. I mean, I was always writing something, maybe not a complete poem, or I didn't even know. Honestly, at that time, I didn't even know if what I was writing was poetry, although some of it looked like poetry. I was just... It was a pivotal time. It was there are some similarities to today, but there are a lot of things that, you had the war going on in Vietnam, you had a lot of civil unrest, and you had a lot of, deservedly, civil unrest, and a lot of things going on, a lot of injustices that needed to be addressed. And I was a kid from a farm, and I was just trying to process this all. The first time really living in a city, too, at university. And so it was my way of trying to figure out what everything was and how I fit into everything.
Now, you wrote a little bit when you were in your first year university, but you sort of put that on the back burner for a while. And eventually you came to Kingston. So how did coming to Kingston happen with respect to being brought up in Colorado?
Okay, I'm going to kind of fill in a gap there.
Yep.
All the way through university, I wrote a fair amount. But then you get busy with life.
Yep.
And raised a family and worked, and I still found time for poetry, but not as much time. But then in the 90s, it's just like I had a rebirth. And then when I started going to writing workshops. I started going to readings and things like that. And my writing became a lot differently. And that's when I really embraced in the mid-90s. And then that's what I came to Kingston with then, when I arrived here in Kingston in 2001.
Let's talk a little bit about the process of writing poems. And I guess for someone like me who has not spent a lot of time thinking about poetry or reading a lot of poetry, the mental concept we have of a poem is that it has to be rhyming and all that sort of thing. What's your process in terms of writing a poem? Where do you start?
Okay. I'm glad I brought that up about how it changed from when I first wrote in university and then in the 90s, because that's when the whole process changed as well. In the first years, it was a lot of that rhyming sequence. And I'd played a musical instrument, so I think I had maybe some internal sense of rhythm or something like that. So that worked for me for quite a while. But then I started to explore just more free verse and things like that, a little less regimented sort of writing. And that's when I think in the earlier stuff I had to, and that's why it's different for everybody too. I think every poet has their own way of creating, but mine moved from more of a thought process where you worked it out mentally, the lines and the words and things like that, to more like, and what still remains, what developed in the late 90s was, I call it more of an intuitive approach, and it's just to simply observe things, maybe write down a couple of words, and then honestly, it's almost like magic when you sit down and just quiet yourself and just kind of, I don't know if it's truly focus or if it's absolutely loose focus, whatever it is, that the words just start to come. It's almost as if someone is reciting the poem to you.
I've had conversations with many different songwriters around,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that I've noticed is that every once in a while they will have stuff in their head that they want to get out, and they want to go into a recording studio and get it all down into the computer so that it's out. It sounds like it's something similar with you, that
Mm-hmm.
there's stuff that's going on in your head, you've got an idea or a few words you want to put down, and then it just comes right out.
Flows right out. Yeah.
I guess for someone who is not creative, that's hard to absorb. In that it seems to all come out as almost a finished poem to a certain extent.
Yeah,
How much
exactly.
do you go back and edit after you've put it down on paper, or do you?
Once in a while you're lucky and it comes out pretty much intact. More often than not, though, most of the time there has to be some editing done, but you've got the bulk of it like that. So,
when you are composing a poem, how much does an audience's potential reaction to your poem influence you when you're writing the poem?
I don't think I go there. I don't think I think about that. I think I just try to be honest to the poem as it arrives, and just allow it to arrive. And there are some, and I mean, I write poems that will never see an audience anyway. You know, they'll never see the light of day. Really, there were sometimes I compare those poems to, and I don't work with them either. I never get to the point where I fully edit them or anything like that. It's almost like I kind of liken it to say a pianist that performs. You're going to hear the performance, but you're never going to hear all of the times they just went through all of their musical scales.
Yeah.
All of those practices. That's what a lot of my poetry is, or just kind of exercises, I guess.
We've asked you to bring along a couple of poems, and can you read one of them now for us?
Sure. This is called Home. Living alone these past 15 years, long ago befriended in it the quietness. Spoke even then of the different notes and arrangements in that music of silence. And always in that time have chosen the aloneness, the smallest of apartments in which to dwell. I do think perhaps I had always the heart of a gypsy, but just never the feather, the wing.
That's called Home.
Yeah.
I can remember going back to high school and taking an English class and having the teacher say, "What do you think the poet meant by these lines?" Is that something that still goes on?
You know what? I don't know. It doesn't ever really... I don't resonate with that sort of thing. I'm more of the belief. I mean, I saw what was the Robin Williams movie where he was a teacher, poetry teacher. Oh my gosh.
Good Will Hunting?
No.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Anyway, I mean, it seemed like the focus of that film, as I recall it, and this is going back a good number of years, but was that I don't believe that, I guess what I'm getting to is I don't believe that there is a meaning for, I think there are a variety of meanings for a line in a poem or the poem itself, that everybody is going to have a little bit of a different interpretation or could have a different interpretation than even the one the poet intended, which is great too.
Yeah.
I mean, my poems might mean something completely different to me than they do to somebody that's listening to them, and that's cool. I mean, if it means something to them, that's wonderful, and if it doesn't, that's wonderful too. But yeah, I don't know that I subscribe to that idea that a line has to be a certain thing, and I don't know if it's still being taught that way.
Paraphrasing something that we've all heard before, meaning is in the ears of the listener.
Yeah.
Let's move on to that movie.
Okay.
Who is BRUCE KAUFFMAN?
Yeah,
Where did this originate?
It was just a few people I know and friends that appreciated some of the things I was doing in the community and thought that it would be a nice way to bring up, because a good portion, I mean, really the basic portion of that film is a lot less to do about me than it is to do about this incredible poetry and artistic community that we have here in Kingston, and it brought filmmakers and poets and musicians all together to create that movie. And so I have, for a long time, helped try to promote as best I can what's going on, and I have created a couple of different projects that have helped to try to move poetry along. Again, had there not been open mic readings, had there not been book launches and workshops and things like that I'd become interested in the late 90s, I don't know if I would be a poet today. So my idea was to go ahead and to see if I could actually create some of those things here so that it would help people who were maybe struggling with poetry or who needed that next thing to happen so that they could, so that they would grow in that. So
I watched the movie. We'll tell our listeners that the movie is available on YouTube. That's where I found it.
Yeah.
And we'll put some directions to where it is in the liner notes to the podcast once we're done here. But that's what the subject I found was the movie was all about. Was that, okay, you are a poet, but there are other people around you who are writing some good stuff, and let's give everyone an opportunity to show people what they are doing as well. So in 2009, you've already alluded to it. You started up this open mic thing. And for those who are not aware, now, I've mentioned this before, and we have folks who listen to this podcast who are not from Kingston, who may be from somewhere else, but I'm sure this sort of thing goes on in all sorts of different communities around the world.
Oh, yeah.
But in 2009, you started an open mic session, and that was the motive, was to get other people to stand up and read what they're writing without any judgment or just to illustrate exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Initial reaction to it when you started?
It was great, actually. So, there may have been a couple of others. I mean, Kingston's a big enough city, and I'm certainly not everywhere. There might have been other ones going on as well at the same time. In fact, I know of at least one other one that was going on at that time, arranged a little bit differently than the way I arranged mine, but you're going to have those variations too. But it was really well received, and so it was and it's gone through now 5 or 6 different venues. Mm-hmm. We're in the Elm Cafe now. We started at the Artel when it was the Artel, and now we're at the Elm Cafe, and even managed to take it through the COVID session just by doing it sort of remotely, but then in McBurney Park as well. So
now you've been doing these monthly, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I find interesting, too, is that it doesn't really matter what art form you're talking about, is that there is a tendency for the people who live in a community to look outside their community for good stuff, whether it be paintings or music or writings or novels or whatever. But sometimes we neglect to look at the great crowd of people who are making stuff right under your nose.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's what I was impressed with, and I couldn't believe the amount of talent that there is here in Kingston, the poetic talent and the number of poets and writers. And if I can kind of extend that a little bit, you might have been going that way anyway, but after I had done that for almost a year, I'm going, these people need the bigger audience than just that. And that's when I went ahead and started my radio show at CFRC.
That's exactly where I was going,
figured
Bruce.
That's kind of where you were leading. So
2010, you started doing a show on CFRC, which for those folks who don't live in Kingston is a station based in the university community here in town. It's been around for over 100 years. The radio station has. The show hasn't been around over 100 years. But it has been around since 2010. It's called Finding a Voice.
Yeah, exactly.
And you do it every week. It's 2 hours every Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
And for those out of town, you can obviously go to cfrc.ca and find the show. It's not just poetry that you do on the show.
No, it's not, because I've tried to, and to make the show viable. I mean, we only had the poetry reading once a month, and so I try to capture whatever readings, book launch events mostly at Novel Idea, but also on Queen's campus. So I try to find a few things that are going on. Even some I've recorded, some remote online things as well. So I do include other things as well, and not strictly poetry either. So, yeah.
You're a one-man show when it comes to doing the program, correct?
Well, yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much. Yeah. We talked about that before we started recording, and if you're going out to do a recording in a hall, you're at the mercy of whoever is sitting around you at the table,
exactly.
shaking the ice cubes inside their glasses. You're trying to record somebody that's 20 or 30 feet away from you. When it comes to the whole business of writing, I've talked about this topic with musicians, and I'll ask you the same sort of question, is that can you make a living as a poet?
If you're really, really lucky, and if you're, I don't know that strictly as a poet, I don't know how easy it would be to do. I would think that maybe, though, if you're a poet, you would find some things that are still, that you might still be passionate about. Like maybe you could make a living being a poet and editing and also doing some other freelance writing or things like that at the same time. You might be able to do it with, if you're lucky enough to get a grant, you might be able to do something like that, and are ambitious enough to look for those grants and apply for those grants and things like that. There are a few people that have done it, like Leonard Cohen and some other people, but...
he even tried singing.
Yeah, he did that.
I just remember when he won an award as Male Vocalist of the Year, and he basically laughed when he received the award because he was not known for his vocal talent, but he was a great writer.
Yeah.
Where does poetry stand these days in terms of its popularity or the people writing poems? Is it are more people writing or less people writing, or who's appreciating it? Do you have a sense of that?
I don't know if it's a sense of that or it's an awareness of it. And maybe it just seems that way. But I know that it seemed to me like it seemed like poetry was kind of rare to find in Kingston when I started open mic. I mean, again, there might have been some things going on that I wasn't aware of that were going on. But some things that had started had finished. Some things, and so it just seemed like overall that it was kind of lower in the scale of things that might be happening. What I noticed, though, is not just in Kingston, but it seemed like it was almost, it became sort of a national or maybe even global sort of thing, that poetry became a lot more important to people. You had the spoken word, and that was already around somewhere, but the spoken word, slam poetry, those kinds of things their popularity starting to grow, and that's taking it away from people like me, taking it down to teenagers and university students. Those kinds of things were more attractive to some of those that maybe couldn't relate to some of the older forms of poetry or the more rigid teachings, I guess, of how poetry should be presented or perceived or whatever. And so that was their way. And again, those things were already happening, but I saw that really start to grow. It became very, very popular in the last 10 years. And there was a lot of spoken word poetry around. So I think I think one thing that really caught my attention was that, of all things, I don't even remember the name of the company, but there was a commercial on TV, and they had used poetry in the holiday season to promote their thing. And I'm going, okay, now if it's reached that level, I guess
we must be doing something right.
Exactly. I don't know.
And I'm thinking, going back to the open mic sessions that you've been doing all along, I would guess that there would be people who have fiddled around and written some poems on their own, but haven't been comfortable enough presenting them to other people. And the open mic gives them the opportunity to do that without anybody criticizing or making comments on it. Yeah.
I found that to be the case. And luckily, and I think purposely, or just the way it's just is, this particular open mic has always been very generous, very compassionate. And I've had people, a lot of times we do things in a first session, and then after an intermission, there's a second session, or however it works out. That people that are coming for the first time and have never read will actually, and they didn't sign up to read, approach me, and occasionally, and quite often it's one or maybe two people will come up to me at intermission and go, is it too late to add my name to the list? So they actually want to get up and read their poem as well, just because they feel comfortable. And then there are also, the other thing that creates too is people know it's coming up, so it's almost an incentive to write something in between. They know it's coming up, they sit down and write a poem just so they have something to present at the next open mic.
Can you give us some sense as to some of the people around town that have started to build a reputation as poets?
Oh, there are a lot of people that have that. I mean, there were some people that were already published. It's been across the board, from people that have never written a poem or really gone to any poetry related event ever, to some really quite well published people too. And so we have a very big cross section that way. Yeah.
There are a couple of other events that seem to happen once a year. One's in the summer, one's in the fall. And one is the Poets at Art Fest. Describe what that is.
That's a multi-day poetry festival, I guess, where anywhere between, and I think this summer is going to be the 9th year of that, usually between 40 and 55 poets over the course of the 3 days, or occasionally 4 days when it's a 4-day weekend. Share a stage in hour-long groups. So we have people coming from. I send the invitation out, and a lot of the poets attending are local, but also all the way from Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, sometimes Peterborough.
And where does this happen?
It happens in City Park as part of ArtFest Kingston.
Okay.
It's tied into that. So we have a stage or a tent, and it's not amplified just because things are kind of tight. So I don't want to intrude in other people's sound space or whatever. And you also have people there trying to make a living selling their wares, right? Sitting right beside you, so that's important to them.
The other event is something that happens in the fall.
Yeah.
And that is 100,000 Poets for Change.
Uh-huh.
So that's an international event?
It is. It's a global event, unfortunately, and I imagine it's going to carry on, but Michael Rothenberg started that event, and I believe that was about 10 or 11 years ago, with his, I believe, partner then, is now, was Terry Callion, I think was her name, but Michael just passed away a few months ago. I assume that these were always events just lined up locally, so people would tie into that theme. Their themes were social justice, environmentalism, peace, love, those kinds of ideas. I imagine that it will still continue because it was all derived locally. I don't know if Terry or someone else will carry on the tradition still then of compiling everything together and kind of having a space for it. They had a Facebook and a website for it, and they would kind of just compile all the different sites, and people would, again, it's locally driven, so it would be people sending the information to them. So I imagine I still plan on creating an event this year as well again. I think this is our maybe 8th year, maybe 7th or 8th year of doing that as well, and it's been held traditionally at the Spire.
Okay, which is part of a church in the downtown of Kingston.
It is.
Yep. Nice spot.
Street United Church, yeah.
Yep. When you mentioned about the some of the topics that people write about for this particular festival, it just sort of popped into my head. You and I are in the same age, and we can remember back to the days of peace and love and Woodstock and all of this. And Ginsberg, I forget his first name. Allen Ginsberg was a well-known poet at the time who was far left in his political leanings, as I recall. Is there somebody like that besides Bruce Kaufman who has that sort of influence these days as a poet?
You know what? I don't think Bruce Kaufman has that sort of influence. So, I mean, I've always said, and I will stick by that, I'm just the doorman. I see, I can see things, and those things wouldn't be there if there weren't already the people there wanting to do them. And I'm just basically opening the door. I don't know. I mean, I'm drawing a blank at names. There are probably some international and famous poets, but I think it's the breadth that's more important, the breadth of poetry and the diversity of poetry that is making poetry grow, actually. And that people go, oh, my God, that's poetry. I can do that. Or I can understand. I can understand this poetry. I couldn't understand that poetry, but I can understand this poetry.
Now, you've published 4 collections, from what I've read, and 4 chapbooks. What's a chapbook?
A chapbook is basically anything that's a smaller version of a book, and I don't know what I'm thinking it's under 40 pages, maybe something like that. It could even be less than that. It could be as many as 2 pages. So it's something less than a full book. If it's a single page, it would just be called a broadside.
Okay.
So, I have those as well, yeah.
Now you are publishing a new book, collection of books.
Yeah.
Now, can we get you to read another poem? Is this from the new book?
The other one was too, and so is this one.
Okay, great.
It's called Telling. I will tell you of a unique building, its storefront. You might like to check, I say. Or I will tell you about a lost place in a forest where two rivers meet, just ahead of the falls. Their waters absolutely intermingled then. And in the telling, I know already before the end of the day, before even the end of this hour, you will have forgotten. That's understandable. You weren't meant to remember. It simply wasn't the right time or place for it. But one day, weeks, months, years, even decades from now, you will come in real life, in happenstance, if such a thing exists. You will stumble upon that very unique storefront, or come upon that lost place in the forest, and hear the falls nearby. And you will look at either for a first time, and you will believe you had never been there before, but you will recognize it in a way you cannot understand or describe. You will feel a fullness in it, a familiarity you cannot explain. You will call it déjà vu. You will remember it for the rest of your life.
Nice.
Thank you.
How important is the reading of a poem to the process?
I think reading a poem, or in hearing anybody read their poems, I think it just adds a whole another layer to the poem, and I think it's important.
It's just the way you read it as well.
I think so.
Yeah. So that's interesting. If someone's interested in finding out more information about the events that you host, the best way to get a hold of you is?
Probably email is the best. I don't carry a cell phone. I haven't owned one in forever almost.
You haven't owned a cell phone?
No. Yeah, it's hard to believe.
So if an idea comes to your mind, you just take out the pen and paper?
That's imperative for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't compose on a computer.
Yeah. Really?
No.
Okay.
I have a theory, and it's just my theory, but I remember reading someplace that we use a different side of the brain to create as we type on a computer than we do when we write. We use the other side when we write with a pen on the paper because it's more sensual. It's more.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's why I've always just preferred the pen to the paper. But getting back to your question, my email address is bruce@hotmail.com.
Okay.
They can get a hold of me. I also create a weekly floating list. I call it a floating list just because it's out there and it's always updated every week. So it's a weekly list of events and calls for submissions. So it lists the few things that I'm aware of as far as upcoming events and calls that are mostly literary, but there are some art-related ones as well. And if they let me know they'd like to receive that, it usually runs from 8 to 12 or 13 pages, just blurbs of all of the things. I'd be happy to send them, include them on the list. It's a free list, yeah.
And what we'll do is we'll put some of this information on the liner notes to the podcast, which is online. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to drop by.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I'm very humbled to be here.
And all the best with the new collection.
Thank you very much.
And all the events that you host.
Thank you.
My guest in this episode, Bruce Kauffman. Let me repeat a couple of contact points for Bruce. To send him an email, his address is bruce.kauffman, and his last name is spelled Kauffman @hotmail.com. And his radio show airs Friday afternoons on CFRC at 101.9 FM and is also available online. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.